March 1, 1945. Düren, Germany. Forward position. 353 3rd Volksgrenadier Division, West Wall, Outer Belt. If you were Hauptmann Werner Kleist, a battery commander holding the Siegfried line north of Aachen, you already understood the mathematics of your position with a professional certainty that bordered on religious conviction. You understood that 3.5 million tons of reinforced concrete had been poured into this defensive belt over 8 years of continuous construction, more concrete than had been used in the entire German Autobahn network. You understood that the Dragon's Teeth anti-tank obstacles lining the approaches had been calibrated to the belly clearance of the most common Allied tanks, down to the centimeter. You understood that every field of fire from every bunker had been pre-registered, that the minefields had been in place to geometric precision, and that the positions your men occupied had absorbed American assault after American assault through the autumn of 1944 without fracturing. What you did not understand, what no German officer holding the West Wall on the morning of March 1st fully grasped, was why the artillery preparation that began at 0300 hours felt qualitatively different from every barrage you had survived in 5 years of war. The number that eventually appeared in U.S. First Army's after-action report for the opening phase of Operation Lumberjack would have seemed like a transcription error to any German artillery officer who read it. In the 18-hour period beginning at midnight on March 1st, American Corps and Army artillery massed against the West Wall sector fired 141,000 rounds across a 90-kilometer front. Not 14,000, not 41,000. 141,000. 141,000. 141,000. 141,000 rounds, at a sustained average of nearly 8,000 shells per hour, against a fortification system that had taken a nation 8 years and the Orgeate Eberserie after. Here is the sentence that explains why the Siegfried Line, Europe's most expensive, most engineered, most carefully designed defensive fortification, did not hold for months or weeks, but collapse in 72 hours. The Americans were not trying to destroy the West Wall. They had found something far more efficient than destruction. Part 1. The wall that was built to win the peace. The West Wall was not a wall. This is the first thing any honest account of its failure must establish, because the misunderstanding of what it was designed to do, and what doctrine governed its use, is the only way to understand why its failure surprised the people who built it, more than it surprised the people who broke it. The West Wall was a defensive zone, a belt of mutually reinforcing concrete emplacements, anti-tank obstacles, minefields, and pre-registered killing grounds stretching 630 kilometers from the Dutch border near Kleve in the north to the Swiss crossing point at Weil am Rhein in the south. Fritz Todt, the engineer who later built the Atlantic Wall and whose name became synonymous with the organizational mobilization of industrial labor for military construction, began the West Wall in 1936. By 1940, it comprised 14,000 fortified positions. German propaganda called it impenetrable. The British called it the Siegfried Line and wrote a satirical marching song about hanging their washing on it. The name stuck. The song did not age well. When American forces first reached the outer fortifications in September 1944, the first foreign army to stand on German soil since Napoleon, the West Wall had been partially stripped. Its original garrison troops, the specialized fortress battalions trained to operate its weapons in coordinated depth, had been sent east to plug gaps on the Russian front. What remained in the bunkers were Volksgrenadier divisions, formations built from the remnants of divisions destroyed in France, filled with older men, younger boys, soldiers recovered from wounds, and transferred Luftwaffe ground personnel who had never trained for the particular demands of coordinated defensive zone fighting. The concrete was in place. The doctrine and the men to execute it were a generation's worth of attrition away. The doctrine itself was not in doubt. Every Wehrmacht officer above company grade had been trained on Herrestdienstvorschrift 300, Army Service Regulation 300, Truppenführung. The German Army Leadership Manual, first issued in 1933 and refined through the campaigns of the first 5 years of war. Its approach to defense was what modern military theorists call elastic. You did not hold every meter of ground. You fought from prepared positions, absorbed the initial blow, then counterattacked with mobile reserves into the flanks of an assault that had overextended itself past its artillery support. The forward positions were not meant to stop the enemy. They were meant to slow him, to channel him, to let the reserve divisions deliver the killing blow. This system had worked in France in 1940, operating offensively. It had worked in Russia in the defensive battles of 1942 and 1943, buying time and bleeding Soviet attackers in the forests and river systems of the Eastern Front. And in October 1944, as American forces were hammering the West Wall's outer positions north of Arques, there were senior German commanders who believed in its efficacy with genuine professional conviction. General Lieutenant Friedrich Koetling, commanding LXX, was among them. Koetling was no propagandist. He was a career professional who had survived Poland, France, and 3 years of Russia, and who understood the arithmetic of defensive warfare as well as any officer the Wehrmacht produced. In his war diary entry for October 12, 1944, he wrote with measured confidence, "The West Wall fortifications provide a defensive foundation that cannot be replicated in open field. A battalion holding bunker positions here is operationally equivalent to 3 battalions in open terrain. If the reserves hold and the ammunition holds, this line holds." Pause on that phrase. If the ammunition holds. Koetling wrote it as a subordinate clause. A professional's footnote, a conditional buried under the main assertion. He did not dwell on it because at that moment in October 1944, dwelling on it seemed unnecessary. The German supply system had operated under catastrophic strain for 4 consecutive years. It had survived Stalingrad's encirclement, the grinding Kursk attrition, the collapse in Normandy. It had always found a way to sustain operations, imperfectly, expensively, but functionally. There was no specific reason, in October 1944, to believe the ammunition question would become the central variable of the entire campaign. What Koechling's doctrine and German logistics doctrine had been calibrated around was a specific understanding of artillery consumption. The Wehrmacht's official allocation for defensive operations by early 1945 was 25 rounds per gun per day for heavy corps artillery and between 15 and 20 rounds for divisional artillery pieces. These figures were not the product of professional conservatism or timidity. They were the product of honest accounting. A supply system whose rail network was being bombed continuously by the U.S. 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command, whose fuel allocation was being compressed by synthetic fuel plant destruction, and whose production base was contracting under strategic bombardment at a rate that no internal reorganization could offset. German ammunition allocation was tight because German ammunition production and delivery capacity was tight. The doctrine was calibrated to operate within real constraints. The American allocation by March 1945 was between 100 and 300 rounds per gun per day in corps artillery. In crisis situations, moments when fire superiority was operationally decisive, it substantially exceeded that ceiling, and the Americans, in March 1945, did not regard the West Wall as a crisis. They regarded it as a scheduled problem. That asymmetry, 20 rounds versus 200 rounds per gun per day, the conservation doctrine against the abundance doctrine, is not a logistical footnote. It is the load-bearing fact underneath everything that followed. But the ammunition disparity alone does not explain the 72-hour collapse. To understand the collapse, you need to understand what the Americans had begun doing with their ammunition that the Germans had no operational category for, and no historical precedent to prepare them for it. The West Wall's concrete was built to outlast a bombardment. What it was not built to outlast was what American First Army Corps artillery was about to deliver in the opening hours of March 1, 1945. Part 2. The Invisible Metric. Here is the core idea, and it is so counterintuitive that it required an army shaped by industrial-era abundance to believe in it. The objective of American artillery at the Siegfried Line was not to destroy the West Wall. The objective was to make it uninhabitable. These are not the same thing, and the difference between them is the entire explanation for what the Germans could not understand. The distinction sounds academic until you understand what American artillery manuals in 1944 called a TOT, fire, mission, time on target. A TOT was not a sustained bombardment. It was coordinated massed fire from multiple batteries, sometimes from dozens of separate gun positions across a frontage of 20 or 30 kilometers, calculated so that every shell from every battery arrived at the designated target point within the same 5-second window, not sequential. Not sustained, simultaneous. One instant, silence. The next instant, the full weight of a core artillery group arriving at one location in a single detonation that had no beginning. You could track and no end. You could anticipate. The physics of what simultaneous arrival did to human beings in prepared fortifications was documented in U.S. Army Research Branch Report, number 138, compiled in 1944 from interviews with survivors of American artillery in both Normandy and the Hürtgen Forest. The key finding was this. The psychological effect of simultaneous mass detonation was not additive but multiplicative. Soldiers who had survived conventional rolling barrages could orient to an incoming pattern, could read the rhythm, predict the pauses, move during intervals, maintain unit cohesion through the disciplined application of their training. Soldiers subjected to TOT fire could not orient. There was no interval. There was only the before and the after, and men who emerged from the after were documented by their own officers in their own divisional logs as functionally unable to speak coherently, unable to hold weapons steadily, unable to execute the coordinated tasks that any defensive doctrine requires of the men who have to implement it. The Germans had a word for the condition: Granatfieber, shell fever. It was not a new phenomenon, but they had never encountered it at the scale, frequency, and simultaneity that American First Army Corps artillery was delivering it in the winter and spring of 1945. The doctrine governing this technique was FM 620, Field Artillery Tactics and Technique, the U.S. Army's artillery manual as revised in 1944. Which formalized massed corps artillery as a weapon of psychological disruption rather than physical destruction. The key philosophical insight embedded in FM 620, the insight for which Truppenfeuer had no equivalent, was that a defender's capacity to resist is not a function of his fortifications. It is a function of his ability to function as a soldier while under fire. Degrade that capacity, and the strongest concrete in Europe becomes a tomb with a sealed door that opens inward. This is where the second variable enters the equation. And this variable was, in December 1944, genuinely invisible to the German army. Not metaphorically invisible. Physically invisible. Because it was the size of a large grapefruit and traveled inside a standard 90mm artillery shell at 2,700 feet per second. The VT fuzz, the variable time fuzz, also called the proximity fuzz, was a radio frequency device embedded in the nose of an artillery shell that transmitted a signal toward the ground as the shell descended and detonated the shell when the return signal indicated it was within 20 to 70 feet of any surface, including soil, including a wooden fence, including a soldier lying flat in the best covered slit trench he could dig in the frozen German earth. Before the VT fusée, artillery effectiveness against infantry in open or partially covered positions required a direct hit or a near miss at the surface. A man in a foxhole, a gun crew behind an earthen parapet, soldiers in the trench systems connecting the west wall bunkers. They had a reasonable expectation that a shell would have to land within a few feet of them to be lethal. After the VT fuse, that expectation was void. The fuse detected the approaching ground through radar return and detonated the shell above it, driving fragments downward in a cone pattern that made horizontal cover nearly irrelevant. You could not dig deep enough for the fragments that came from above. The west wall's concrete protected men from direct hits when they were inside it. It could not protect men emerging from it to operate weapons, observe fire, or transmit orders, the exact moments when the men had to be outside. It could not protect men emerging from it to operate weapons, observe fire, or transmit orders. The Germans captured samples of this fuse in the Ardennes in December 1944. They sent the components to Berlin to the Heereswaffenamt, the Army Weapons Office, where analysts examined them in January 1945. The preliminary assessment, recovered by American intelligence officers after the war, correctly identified the function of the device. The German engineers understood what it was. What they could not do, what the compression of time, the collapse of industrial capacity, and the impossibility of replicating the fuse's miniaturized radio components in the conditions of 1945 Germany made impossible, was produce a counter or a copy. The analysis sat in a file. The shells kept falling. Here is what the silence looked like from inside the west wall. On March 2, 1945, Generalleutnant Harald von Elverfeld, commanding the 9th Panzer Division in the sector east of Düren, transmitted a situation report to Army Group B headquarters. The document was recovered intact after the war and is held in the German military archives in Freiburg. Von Elverfeld wrote, "Artillery fire of a weight and character without precedent in my experience has made forward position defense functionally impossible in the last 48 hours. Casualties in exposed positions are running at rates I have not witnessed outside of the worst Eastern Front engagements, despite the presence of hardened infrastructure. The source of the anomalous casualty pattern has not yet been confirmed. The anomalous casualty pattern. That is a German professional officer in March 1945 writing about American artillery in the language of scientific bewilderment. He had no category for what he was experiencing because his doctrine, his training, and his 4 years of operational experience had given him no framework for a weapons system that made cover tactically irrelevant at the exact moment when his defensive doctrine required his men to step outside their cover and fight. It is worth noting what the Soviet Army did with the same problem, penetrating a prepared defensive line, because the contrast illuminates how differently two industrial powers could approach an identical challenge. At Operation Bagration in June 1944, the Red Army massed between 150 and 200 guns per kilometer of front and fired for hours, sometimes days, before infantry moved forward. It was destruction by pure weight. Effective, but requiring days of preparation and consuming ammunition at a rate only Soviet industrial output could sustain. The American method was different. Fewer hours, fewer shells per kilometer than Bagration, but faster, simultaneous, and aimed not at the concrete, but at the minds of the men inside it. 2 methods. 1 enemy. The question the Germans could not answer was, which method you defend against both? There was no answer in Truppenführung. There was no answer in the West Wall's concrete. There was an answer in the American supply chain. But to understand that, you have to go back 7 months, to the roads of northern France. Part 3. The river that fed the guns. The 141,000 shells that opened Operation Lumberjack did not materialize at the firing line through professional efficiency alone. They arrived there because of one of the largest and most improvised military logistics operations in the history of warfare. An operation that the U.S. Army had no doctrine for, no planning infrastructure for, and which was kept running entirely by the endurance and mechanical ingenuity of 12,500 soldiers. Approximately 75% of whom the U.S. Army had officially classified as unfit for combat. The Red Ball Express, formerly designated the Red Ball Highway, began operations on August 25, 1944, 3 days after the breakout from the Normandy bocage. The strategic problem was this: American forces were advancing faster than the logistical system that had been designed to support them. The pre-war planning for a European campaign had assumed the capture of Channel ports within weeks of the invasion and the use of those ports for the bulk supply flow. The ports were not functioning. Cherbourg had been systematically demolished by the Germans before its capture. The pipeline from the beaches to the front was a truck route across northern France, and the front was moving east at 30 to 40 miles per day. General Dwight Eisenhower's staff created the Red Ball Express in 72 hours of emergency planning. It was a one-way truck circuit, westbound lanes inbound empty, eastbound lanes outbound loaded, running 420 miles from the Normandy depots to the forward supply dumps of 12th Army Group near Paris and beyond. At its operational peak, the Red Ball moved 12,332 tons of materiel per day, not per week, per day. The entire German supply operation to the Western Front, running through a bombed railroad network, through fuel shortages, through interdiction that grounded daylight truck movement in many sectors, was sustaining roughly 2,000 tons per day to all of Army Group B. The Americans were moving 4 times that volume, from twice the distance by truck. Every share of this video keeps the story of the men who made those numbers possible alive for a few more people who would otherwise never encounter it. The trucks were 6,000 2.5-ton GMC CCKWs, the deuce and a half that became the most produced military vehicle in American history. The drivers were from quartermaster truck companies that the War Department had designated as support formations. Under the racial policies governing the USC Army in 1944, black soldiers were officially deemed unsuitable for frontline combat roles and were assigned in disproportionate numbers to service and support branches, transportation, engineering, ammunition handling, laundry. The Red Ball Express, by its own internal records, was 3/4 staffed by African American soldiers. One of them was Corporal James A. Blake of the 38888th Quartermaster Truck Company, operating from a forward depot near Liège, Belgium, in February 1945. Blake's service record, preserved in Record Group 319 at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, documents that between February 1 and February 28th of that year, he logged 4,100 miles of driving, approximately the road distance from New York to Los Angeles, hauling 155 Memon howitzer shells from rail transfer points to 1st Army Corps ammunition dumps. His GMC CCKW was rated for 2.5 tons of payload. In common practice across the Red Ball and its successor operations, drivers routinely carried 4.5 to 5 tons because the forward depots needed the ammunition, and returning partly loaded was not an option the operational tempo allowed. What Corporal Blake could not have known, what no driver in his company knew, was that the shells stacked in his cargo bed would be expended in a single 18-hour window against a fortification that had consumed 8 years of German national construction capacity. He knew his route. He knew his delivery point. He did not know what the delivery point was supplying, or what that supply was about to accomplish. He knew the German artillery harassed the roads at night. He knew that his truck's headlights were blacked out. He knew that the men directing his work were white officers who received formal commendations that did not routinely travel downward to the men who had performed the physical labor. Here is the specific irony. The United States Army had formally classified black soldiers as unsuitable for direct combat. The artillery barrage that broke the most heavily fortified defensive line in European history was materially possible because men classified as unsuitable for combat drove the ammunition that fired it. Now lay that against what General der Infanterie Gustav Adolf von Zangen, commanding German 15th Army in the Aachen sector, recorded in his February 1945 logistics estimate. Von Zangen's situation report calculated that his divisions were receiving an average of 18% of their authorized ammunition allotment, not 80%. Not 50%, 18%. His heavy artillery batteries, authorized 25 rounds per gun per day, were averaging between 4 and 5 rounds delivered. On some days, 0. His anti-tank gun crews were being instructed to hold fire until American armor was within 400 meters, not for tactical effect, but because they did not have enough rounds to engage at standard defensive ranges. The German system was not failing because of tactical incompetence. It was failing because, P-47 Thunderbolts of the 9th Tactical Air Command had made German daylight road movement near suicidal throughout February 1945, and because the rail network feeding Army Group B had been systematically attacked throughout that same period. The doctrine that had allowed the Wehrmacht to function on improvised supply, on partial ammunition allocation, on scavenged fuel, and transferred equipment, that doctrine had allowed the Wehrmacht's supply on partial ammunition allocation, on scavenged fuel, and those 4 rounds per gun per day, 200 rounds per gun per day. That is not a tactical disparity. That is a physical law. And there was about to be one more factor added to the equation, a factor that compounded the artillery advantage in a way that no German officer in the West Wall could have fully anticipated. Part 4. The Realization. The first German officer of genuine consequence to understand in writing what American fire superiority was actually doing to the Wehrmacht's defensive capacity was not a corps commander or an army group chief of staff. It was a panzer general who had been beaten by it before, who had walked through its aftermath when it was done with him, and who had spent the intervening 8 months attempting to describe the experience in terms that professional military superiors might find credible. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein commanded Panzer Lehr Division through Normandy, through Operation Cobra, through the Ardennes offensive, and into the Rhine defense in early 1945. Panzer Lehr was one of the Wehrmacht's elite armored formations, a division staffed initially with demonstration school instructors, equipped with the latest German armor, and structured to showcase the operational excellence of German panzer doctrine. On July 25, 1944, the opening day of Operation Cobra, American heavy bombers and corps artillery had erased 3/4 of Bayerlein's division in a single afternoon. He survived. He walked the ground after Roux, at a rate. In his post-war interrogation transcript collected by U.S. Army historical teams in May and June 1945, now preserved in the National Archives, Bayerlein stated, "What occurred at St. Lo was not an artillery preparation in any sense my training had prepared me for. My men were not casualties in the conventional understanding. Those who were not dead were neutralized, biologically incapable of performing as soldiers. We had built our doctrine on the assumption that after a bombardment ends, units reorganize and mount resistance. The bombardment at Cobra was of a kind that made that reorganization physically impossible for the period of time the Americans required to exploit it. Bayerlein had spent the following 8 months attempting to convey this to OKW, the German Supreme High Command, in terms that would produce a doctrinal response. He was heard but not acted upon, because acting upon what he was describing would have required matching American production capacity, developing equivalent fire control technology, and maintaining ammunition stocks at American consumption rates. None of those things were available to the Wehrmacht in the autumn and winter of 1944. Bayerlein's assessment was accurate. It was also operationally irrelevant because the correct response to it was impossible. By February 1945, Bayerlein was commanding a corps-level formation in the Eifel region, holding positions feeding into the West Wall's eastern approaches. His improvised counter-doctrine, developed from his own combat experience, with no sanction in Truppenführung, was dispersion. Rather than holding coherent defensive positions that American fire control officers could identify and mass fire against, he had instructed his forward elements to break into small groups, to move constantly, to present no formed position worth a taut fire mission. The approach was sound, tactically. It partially reduced the effectiveness of observed fire against his units during the Eifel withdrawal. It did not work against taut missions keyed on area targets rather than point targets, target point targets. And it did not work against the proximity fusée which detonated on approach to any warm body, whether that body was part of a coherent defensive position or a dispersed 3-man team moving through a frozen tree line. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding 7th Corps, U.S. First Army, was the officer most directly responsible for the artillery architecture that Bayerlein was trying, and failing, to answer. Collins had studied the failed September 1944 attempts to penetrate the West Wall, assaults that had relied on direct infantry attack with inadequate artillery preparation, and had drawn the operationally correct lesson. The West Wall was not impenetrable. It was impenetrable when attacked in a way its designers had anticipated. Collins's solution was to attack in a way its designers had not anticipated and could not have anticipated because the relevant technology did not exist when the West Wall was designed. In his operational directive for Lumberjack, Collins formalized the concept in writing. Preparation fires will not be assessed by damage to fortifications. They will be assessed by suppression interval, the documented period during which the defending force is psychologically incapable of coordinated resistance. Infantry will attack within that interval. If the interval is achieved, the fortification is irrelevant. The suppression interval, that was the metric Collins was measuring. The Germans were measuring concrete survival and casualty ratios. Collins was measuring minutes. Two armies was measuring minutes. Two armies. Two armies. Two completely different definitions of what success looked like on the same battlefield, at the same hour, against the same objective. The 9th Panzer Division attempted the only documented large-scale German adaptation in the first week of March 1945. They withdrew their forward garrisons from the West Wall's outer belt before the American preparation fires began, conceding the initial ground voluntarily in order to preserve unit integrity for a counterattack from the 2nd Defensive Zone. The tactic, reverse slope defense, pre-planned withdrawal, counterattack from reserve, was pure Truppenführung. Elastic defense, executed by professionals. It bought the division approximately 24 hours of organized resistance. Then American armored exploitation moved faster than the German reserve could consolidate its counterattack positions. The withdrawal lines were shelled before the reserve elements could form. The counterattack never happened. A failed adaptation tells you something specific. It tells you that the German doctrine was not wrong in theory. It was correct in theory, executed with professional competence, and still structurally insufficient. When your reserve formations cannot reach the battlefield before the enemy's exploitation phase closes the window, elastic defense is no longer elastic. The retreat is real. The springback is not. For any German officer reading von Elverfeld's situation reports, Beerlein's assessment of Cobra, and the 9th Panzer's failed adaptation in sequence, there was no tactical answer available. The ingredients for one did not exist in the Wehrmacht of March 1945. Part 5. The Verdict. March 7, 1945. 52 hours. Remagen, Germany. The West Bank of the Rhine. Sergeant Alexander Drabik of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, 9th Armored Division, crossed the Ludendorff rail bridge on foot under scattered rifle fire from the far bank and became the first American combat soldier to stand on German soil east of the Rhine River. He was 31 years old. He was from Holland, Ohio. He ran across the bridge, and he did not stop running until he was on the other side, and when he got there he dropped into a crater and looked back at the bridge still standing behind him, and later told the men around him he could not believe the goddamn thing was still up. The bridge should have been blown. The German engineer officer responsible for its demolition had the order, had the charges emplaced, had attempted to trigger the detonation. The primary circuit failed. The cable had been severed by American artillery fire in the preceding 24 hours. The backup charge produced a partial detonation that damaged the superstructure but did not drop the span. Within 2 hours, American infantry was crossing in force. Within 24 hours, American infantry was crossing in force. Within 24 hours, the first American armored vehicles were on the east bank of the Rhine. Sergeant Drabik crossed that bridge because of what had happened west of it in the preceding hours. The Siegfried line did not collapse because of one intact bridge. It collapsed because 7th Corps, X Corps, and 3 Corps of U.S. First Army had, beginning on March 1st, applied the Tat and Vitiefus formula at operational scale across a 90-kilometer front, had advanced 50 miles in 6 days, had bypassed Cologne from the south while other American forces cleared it from the west, and had rendered the entire West Wall concept operationally irrelevant before a single German demolition team reached Remagen with fresh detonating wire. Now here is the forensic audit. The Germans were right about the concrete. The West Wall's fortifications performed exactly as designed under direct observed fire. American artillery could not, in any direct sense, destroy 3.5 million tons of reinforced concrete in 18 hours. The physical structure of the West Wall survived Operation Lumberjack's preparation fires. The Germans had the correct understanding of what concrete could absorb. The metric they were measuring was this: does the fortification physically withstand the assault? By that measurement, the West Wall was not failing in March 1945. The bunkers stood. The dragon's teeth remained. The minefields were largely intact. By their own measure, the situation was not catastrophically different from October 1944, when the line had held. The metric the Americans were measuring was entirely different. Can the defenders maintain organized resistance during the exploitation window? Not for a week. Not for a day. For the 45 to 90 minutes between the lifting of preparation fires and the arrival of American armored infantry at the first bunker line, by that measurement, the West Wall was failing catastrophically, not because it was being destroyed, but because the men inside it were being rendered temporarily non-functional at precisely the moment when the entire defensive system required them to function. Two armies, two different definitions of what it meant to hold a defensive line. Neither definition fully visible to the other across the divide of doctrine and industrial reality. The Germans measured the battle in concrete and ground. The Americans measured it in minutes of suppression and miles of exploitation. They were not fighting the same war. They were fighting two different conceptions of what victory in this kind of engagement looked like. This is the principle that extends beyond the West Wall, beyond Germany, beyond 1945. An institution optimizes for the metric it was built to measure. When the enemy changes the metric, the institution does not necessarily know. It keeps performing well on its own measurement and losing on the new one simultaneously. The West Wall's defenders performed correctly, professionally, by every standard their doctrine gave them. They lost anyway. That is not a paradox. That is what happens when your enemy rewrites the scoring system and your institutional structure has no mechanism for reading the new rules. The consequence is compounded. It compounded in the form of 317,000 German prisoners taken by U.S. 1st and 9th Armies in the Ruhr Pocket between April 1 and April 18, 1945, the single largest mass surrender of German forces on the Western Front, made possible by the encirclement that the Remagen crossing had enabled. It compounded in the form of 53 German divisions rendered combat ineffective west of the Rhine between February 8 and March 25, 1945, formations that represented the last organized Mobile Reserve Army Group B possessed, and that could not be reconstituted in the time remaining before the war's end. It compounded in the form of Feldmarschall Walter Modé, commanding Army Group B in the Ruhr Pocket, who on April 15, 1945, formally disbanded his command, released his soldiers from their oaths, and walked alone into the forest near Düsseldorf. He was found on April 21st. He was 50'd on April 21st. He was 54 years old, and he had believed, with professional sincerity, that tactical excellence could substitute for material parity across a wide enough front for a long enough time. It could not. He had been right about nearly everything except the one variable that controlled all the others. It compounded in the form of every German civilian west of the Rhine who had been assured the West Wall was impenetrable, standing in the spring of 1945 watching American supply convoys roll east along roads that had been, 8 months earlier, the logistical arteries of the Third Reich's Western defense. Every subscription, every share, every comment keeps the names of Corporal Blake and Sergeant Drobick and the 12,500 drivers who made the ammunition possible for a few more people who would otherwise never encounter them. The men who built the artillery system that broke the Siegfried line had names that history has not always remembered. Colonel Edmund Butcher coordinated 7th Corps Artillery and executed the TOT doctrine that Collins had specified. Corporal James Blake drove the ammunition that made it possible. Sergeant Alex Drabick crossed the bridge their work had opened. None of them were told precisely that they were dismantling the most expensive military fortification in European history. They were told to do their jobs. They did their jobs. They did their jobs. Here is the verdict. The Siegfried line did not fall because American soldiers are braver than German soldiers, or because American generals outthought German generals at the tactical level. It fell because one army had found a way to measure battlefield victory that the other army's doctrine had no category for, and because the industrial foundation of one nation had made it possible to apply that new measurement at a scale that exceeded any individual fortification's capacity to absorb. The concrete was irrelevant. The men inside it were not, and the men inside it were not, and the men inside it would not function. For 72 hours that was enough. That is the verdict. The doctrine that fired 141,000 shells at the West Wall in 18 hours did not stay in Germany. It traveled to Korea, where American Corps artillery applied the same mass fire suppression principles against Chinese infantry at the Imjin River in April 1941, massed tot fires against a human wave assault that had no answer for simultaneous detonation. It traveled to Vietnam, where the proximity fuse was used against NVA troops in jungle clearings and encountered, for the first time, a terrain environment that partially degraded its effectiveness, forcing the doctrine to evolve again. It was rebuilt from the ground up as air-land battle in the 1980s, a direct doctrinal descendant of Collins's suppression interval concept, updated for a Soviet armored threat on the North German plain. And when that doctrine met its first large-scale test in the Gulf War in 1991, the Iraqi Republican Guard defending prepared positions in Kuwait discovered, as the German army had discovered in 1945, that concrete and earthworks do not constitute a defense when the enemy has changed the metric. But that is a different story. The West Wall took 8 years to build. It took 72 hours to make obsolete. That is not a story about firepower. That is a story about what happens when one side stops counting what the other side is counting, and the other side never notices until the bridge is already gone.